Good morning, good afternoon. We're just going to wait like a minute or two till people enter. So let's give it a minute. I hope everybody's having a good day in these scary times. Okay. So welcome to our webinar, which is a riff on the UK AI Summit, Safety Summit, which begins November 1st and 2nd. So the UK has said that this summit will focus on risks created or significantly exacerbated by the most powerful AI systems, particularly those associated with the potentially dangerous capabilities of these systems. The summit will also focus on how safe AI can be used for public good and to improve people's life. The summit is truly multinational, and we are lucky to have an international crew discussing the summit. So let me introduce our three speakers today. So we're going to begin. We have Katie Shilton from the University of Maryland Information School, Gina Neff, who is the director of the Minderoo Center at Cambridge University and co-lead Responsible AI UK, and Tom Goldstein, who is a professor of computer science at the University of Maryland. Let me also thank the many organizations that we partner with for these webinars. This is our 39th webinar and 9th Minderoo webinar. So what I've asked our speakers to do is they will begin by taking 3 to 5 minutes each to describe the main risks of AI. I will then ask them a few questions, and then we want you to ask them some questions, which I'll read out loud. And so please prepare your questions and thoughts, and these three experts can answer them. So Tom, if I may start with you, what are the main risks of AI?
Well, you hear a lot about various kinds of economic risks, like job displacement. One of the risks that I am concerned about that I think we don't hear about too much is the potential increase in the level of mass surveillance that we see. In the past, surveillance has been a big problem, particularly in authoritarian countries, but for the most part, surveillance has taken place using computer vision systems. So, for example, in China, they have a large-scale surveillance technologies, especially in urban areas where they keep track of where people go, what people do. They can see when people cross the street. And that surveillance technology is the rise of that surveillance technology is very concerning. But with the rise of large language models, we'll see that surveillance technology can potentially take other forms. So right now, it's very difficult to perform mass surveillance on everyone's text messages, on everyone's phone calls. Even just a few years ago, I think doing that kind of mass surveillance would be very difficult because language technologies were just trailing very far behind, far behind computer vision technologies. But nowadays, with even a smart undergraduate could potentially build a phone call surveillance system. You could just use the off-the-shelf Whisper model from OpenAI to do speech-to-text transcription, and then you could use a large language model to ask all sorts of questions about what is being discussed and do all sorts of analysis on the text, right? So one of my concerns is I think that within the next few years, there's a risk that we'll start to see large-scale surveillance take all sorts of new forms that it hasn't in the past. And then another risk that I'm more worried about, maybe more in the near future, and maybe focus more on what's happening in the United States, is that we've seen a decline in recent years of the profitability of news media, and that has really restricted the kinds of news media that people have access to. And the emergence of generative search, so tools like Bard right? Things like all of these new generative search features inside of Bing. These have the potential to take more clicks away from news media websites. It's going to make it much more difficult for those websites to be profitable. And we might see even further changes and further declines in the health of the news media ecosystem. No, Susan, I think you're muted.
You are right. It's like, this is my first webinar ever. Okay, thank you for that summary. Really appreciate it. Let's go to Gina Neff in the UK.
And it's really great to be here. So I'm here wearing a couple of hats, as Susan mentioned. One is running the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy at Cambridge. The other is one of the collaborators and the head of the strategy group on the UK's new Responsible AI UK program. This is a multi-campus investment by the UK government into building stronger ecosystems for responsible AI research and practice and development. So let me start the answer from my Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy hat. Our center is really focused on 4 key threats that we see to societies. And we see those threats as something that didn't start or originate with the latest version of generative AI, but rather something that is about and built into our digital technology infrastructure. And the first would really be trust in society. So to follow up on Tom's point, I think one of the biggest risks we face now from the systems that we see now are their ability to change how people trust in one another and how people trust in society. So that's not saying that generative AI or other AI systems change that trust. It's saying there's something going on with trust in society already, and these new technologies are simply amplifying these things more obvious to more people. The second concern that we really focus on is what are the climate impacts of the digital technologies that we use. And we've already seen that our digital infrastructure today.
Gina, I'm sorry to be such a rude person, but we're having problems with your audio. There's like almost an echo.
Okay. Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, sorry. Let me know if that does, and then we'll go back to maybe Katie and I can shift into that. Is this better? Yes, thumbs up. Great. So trust in society, the environmental impact of these technologies is a second one. The third one really is these questions of what are we doing with the future of work? This is something that we are focusing on and taking an approach that understands that how we talk about work is how we talk about people's feeling of belonging in society and what they how they feel important, how they feel a part of society. And the fourth is really to change the perception that these technologies are simply neutral, that more people need to be involved in the conversations, more people need to be brought into the decisions, more people need to be brought into the design, that we have some real blind spots when it comes to thinking about the digital futures that we want. So with that context, when we talk about the AI risks that we face, the kinds of work that I do in my daily work is really on the near term and medium term risks to ordinary people in their everyday lives. Unfortunately, that's not what's on the agenda for the AI summit that's being hosted by the UK next week. So I'm gonna bracket how those risks are talked about and what that might mean when we come into other questions, but I'm going to just foreshadow that there are ways that we talk about these questions of surveillance, as Tom mentioned, of bias, of participation, of power in society. These are really key and important questions around how we're building the tools that will be the infrastructure for the future. And when we talk about responsible AI, when we talk about doing this development for responsible technology, we have to have these kinds of conversations absolutely at the center of the design, the development, the deployment, and the use of these systems. So with that, thank you, Susan. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you for that. Just a quick question in that regard. Why do you think there is this mismatch between what you're saying are the risks and what Tom is saying what the summit is actually trying to do?
Yeah, the summit is on a very narrow slice of the whole world of machine learning and artificial intelligence, right? It's in the introduction to the ideas of the summit, the UK government said that what they're calling narrow AI will only be addressed in the sense that it has potential for really big risks. So say bioweapons or military risks. And the risks of generative AI are also on the table. The risks of frontier AI are also on the table. What are the very large risks to society at that? So they're bracketing off these risks of the everyday. This has caused a lot of debate and a lot of angst in the AI ethics community, because the kind of ethics that many people have been working on in the information space just simply aren't on the table. I've got a theory. This summit is about, in part, ensuring that we get the US and China to sit down together. It's why the summit is not being held in either of the top two largest AI countries in the world. It's being held in the UK. The UK is seen as a little bit more of a neutral territory in that sense. And the US has no interest geopolitically in talking about responsible AI. They may have other reasons to talk about responsible AI, but if they want to be able to have a conversation in a very heightened geopolitical time with China, it's going to be on this very narrow, very technical subject. There's only 100 people in the room at Bletchley Park. So it's being held in a very small location. It's giving both sides, both the US and China, the opportunity to save face, while also bringing together some much needed international coordination and cooperation at a time when tensions are pretty high.
Thank you so much, Gina. Katie?
Thank you. So, I mean, I am going to build a little bit on themes I'm hearing from both Gina and Tom. And as I largely agree that the risks in the here and now are sort of what I'm very focused on and what I think are big. I mean, what you define as a big risk is confusing to me here, right? You know, because I see fraud and surveillance as big risks, but right. And I understand, Gina, completely what you're saying makes a lot of sense. So I come from a field, science and technology studies, that thinks a lot about not only the ways we govern technologies, which are important to this conversation, right? But the way that technologies govern us, co-construction, right? It goes both ways. Technologies aren't neutral tools, as Gina said, and they never have been, but AI really makes the case neatly for why they are not neutral tools. They are tools that govern us, that makes some things easier, some things harder. And the kinds of things that AI is increasingly making easier are things that concern me rather than excite me. And not entirely. I mean, there are things that excite me, but I think there's a lot to be concerned. So I just want to call out sort of three themes that, you know, when we think about how AI governs us, are, I think, big risks. The first is the question of sort of shoddy indicators. So I'm a social scientist. I work with computer scientists, but I'm a social scientist. And I think a lot about things like indicators, right? What is the phenomenon? Does this data think what we mean it means? Like, does it mean what we think it means? And what is this a good indicator of? And my entire career, I've watched computer scientists building systems struggle with not having the social indicators that they want. They have what we have, what is computationally available, right? And then we try to make meaning out of that. And sometimes, frequently, it's not a great indicator of the thing that we want. So I think about psychometric prediction systems that are used in hiring, right? Where the indicators that might be on somebody's CV are put into a system, and an output of personality is spit out. And in psychology, folks would say, well, first of all, personality isn't like a stable construct, right? That's not something that we, and then B, the indicators that are on somebody's CV of their personality, like it's junk science, right? It doesn't line up. So these kinds of things can keep happening in the AI space, where we have some data, we take it, we try to pattern match, we try to make predictions with it, and it doesn't end up being an indicator of the thing we want it to be. So construct validity and reliability is something I think a lot about as a risk. Like, we are not always measuring what we think we're measuring, and when we try to make decisions based on that, that can be a real problem. The second is sort of the ways that AI, because of, and especially these large foundation models, my colleague Jordan Boyd-Graver at Maryland makes a really good case, I think, for calling these Muppet models. It matters what we call them, right? But that this idea that these models, they center the center. They tend to favor, especially language models, because of the way they're trained and because of the way they're tuned. They center majority voices, majority opinions. And this can lead to real problems with not seeing the margins, or with excluding the margins. We see this a lot with medical systems as well, right? Medical prediction systems that we have seen are biased again and again against Black Americans specifically, because they are trained largely with data from white Americans. So this sort of like increasingly centering the center, like, this is not what we need our tech to do for us. We already do this, right? Like, why are we building tech that makes it even harder to see that we're centering the center? And then the last thing, and this builds a bit on what Tom was saying, the cost of fraud and fraudulent behavior is just going down. These technologies make it, and we see this with students, right? And my students have many excellent uses for things like ChatGPT to quiz themselves and things like that. But I also know that some of them are using them to produce text, and it's very hard for me to spot, right? And that's just a little example. This gets big when we start looking at moderators on Reddit who are being bombarded with fake questions that they have to weed out now, and their jobs were already hard, and now they are weeding. When we think about scams, when we think about the cost of all of these things is just getting lower, while our ability to, and people like Tom have been involved in countermeasures, watermarking, things like that, but it is the cat and mouse we are losing at the moment, and I worry about that. So those are the risks that I think a lot about.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Muppet models. You might want to explain that to our audience.
Yeah, Jordan has a really nice way of thinking about this. Part of it is a legacy of naming these models. There are actually quite a few Muppet names. Elmo and Bert models are already in the mix. And his argument is that you want to think about these things as something that we can have control of all the way through. So not just a puppet, which we control at a few points, but a Muppet where there is a controller, a human controller all the way through the model. This is my Muppet, sorry. I'm not doing a very good Muppet here. And that we, but and also it raises questions of trustworthiness. You might check what a Muppet tells you, right? It might not be the most authoritative source, and I really love both of those analogies. The human control all the way through is necessary, and also check what it tells you.
Okay, thank you. I noticed people have started to put some questions in the Q&A, and we really appreciate that. I encourage you to ask questions. I'm going to keep at it with people, but the next half hour is all yours until 1. So please do add your questions. Okay, so now we've learned 3 different perspectives on the risks. Given those risks, how would you suggest governments should regulate? I'll just remind you of some options as to how they can. They can regulate by type of AI. They can regulate by direct regulation of risk. So the risk inherent in the type of AI. They can regulate business practices. They can ban certain types of AI. They can regulate the data. What do you suggest? Tom, we'll start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. So I think there's 2 important directions that we need to think about. First is we just need Congress to be, maybe this doesn't pertain to a specific kind of regulation, but in general, I think that we need Congress to be more proactive about rewriting laws that govern things like data usage and copyright issues for generative AI. Right now, it seems like the plan right now is to just let the courts write all the laws, and that's not how things are supposed to go, but that's definitely the way that things are going. And I can give you a concrete example of that. Right now, there's a barrage of lawsuits that are going through the courts that pertain to generative AI. And some of them, depending on how the courts choose to interpret the law, could really have a major impact on how existing data usage and copyright laws impact tech firms at large, not just generative AI companies. I can give you one particular example. There's this lawsuit, Getty Images, this image company that owns copyright on a lot of different image assets. They are suing Stability AI, a company that makes one of these text-to-image diffusion models, and they are claiming that their data scraping practices, so the lawsuit really focuses on this claim that the data scraping practices that were used to create Stability's model are a violation of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So the DMCA says that it is illegal to remove or modify the copyright information that is attached to digital media. And on Getty's webpage, where they show all of their images, on that webpage, it will show the image, but it will also say things about what sort of copyright is attached to that image and what the terms of use are. There's links to other parts of their website that might contain other legal notices about the use of their images. And so Getty is claiming that by downloading the images into a database and caching them locally in a way that is removed from the context of the website, that removes DMCA protected copyright information. Now, if the courts were to rule with Stability, it would basically create a regime where there's no rules around, at least no new rules around data set usage and how you have to respect people's copyrights. But at the same time, if the courts were to rule with Getty and say that these kind of data scraping practices are illegal because of DMCA, it would actually wreak havoc in the entire tech community. There are all sorts of tools that need to be able to locally download and cache images. Your laptop locally caches images when you visit websites. There are companies that are main cornerstones of infrastructure for the entire internet. Companies like Akamai, for example, that just do data caching to speed up information transfer. You have services like Google that rely a lot on data caching in order to make things efficient and to make things work. So an adverse ruling in this case, depending on how it's written, could really create a lot of havoc for the entire digital economy, right? But this is just an example of why letting the laws get written by this combination of class action attorneys and lawyers is probably not a good idea. Depending on the outcome of this lawsuit, we're going to either end up with no new oversight or regulations at all, or we might end up with a much more difficult regime to work with, right? So Congress really needs to get proactive and start thinking about what these laws should look like. One of the things that I think is a good idea in the long run is we need to think about how to have a regulatory agency. I constantly see people in the government talking about how to regulate AI, and we tend to really flounder on that question. I have a biologist friend, he's a cancer biologist, and he says, we will never have a cure for cancer because cancer is not a disease. Cancer is 1,000 diseases. But in the public's mind, we treat them all like they're one disease, when really the biology and the mechanisms of all of them are completely different, right? It doesn't make sense to treat them holistically. And I think we have something similar that's going on with AI. People talk about how we're going to have regulation for AI, but AI really refers to so many diverse technologies and so many diverse products that having one single set of overarching regulations that says anything meaningful about them is really just impossible. And I think that this is one of the reasons why we keep having trouble moving forward. So in the long run, what we really need is a regulatory agency. If we want to be able to have broad rules and regulations for what we consider to be reasonable data usage, what we consider to be reasonable level of respecting people's privacy, what we expect to be a reasonable level of respecting people's copyrights, we need a regulatory agency that can look at products and look at the individual practices of companies and make a decision of whether what they're doing is reasonable, and then communicate and work with those companies to get them into compliance. Otherwise, I just don't think that there's any way forward. But right now, I think companies in general, corporations have been holding their breath and not saying anything about what those regulations would look like. I think everyone is waiting to see what comes through the courts. If there's no adverse rulings on any of these cases in the courts, then maybe the companies can sort of get away scot-free with no new regulations. But if you end up with a very restrictive ruling that makes it makes it difficult to operate a company, we may end up in a situation where companies are suddenly very happy to have a regulatory agency and very eager to have an agency that they can work with to be in compliance, rather than just ending up back in court over and over again with these class actions. So we'll see. And in a few months, once things make their way a little further through the courts, we might have different feelings from people in industry about whether they want that regulatory agency.
It's interesting to me that your risks and what you focused on just now are slightly different. I was surprised that you didn't say that we need to regulate actual business practices, but that's just my opinion. We can get back to that in a second. Professor Neff.
Thanks, Susan. How's my sound? Is that better? Good. Tom, I think this is really interesting. We at MCTD, along with the Bennett Institute for Public Policy and the University of Cambridge-wide initiative AI at CAM, just released last week a report on what the UK policy should be on generative AI. And as some of you might know, in the UK National White Paper on AI doesn't call for a single regulator. So it takes a very distinct approach to how the EU is approaching regulation in this space, by essentially saying that AI will be regulated within the existing regulators, right? So there's 1,000 different ways of AI. There's already spun up pharmaceutical regulation. There's already spun up regulation in workplace health and safety. There's already spun up regulation in financial markets. That's where, quote unquote, AI should be regulated, right? In the distinct kinds of existing regulators. The challenge with that in the short term is, first, there really are, as you pointed out, a set of business practices and impacts that are new and cut across different kinds of business activities, different kinds of life activities. And there's also a set of there's a set of capabilities that aren't there yet. So governments are struggling in terms of having regulators who actually understand what new technologies are and how to work on them. So building that core capacity around what is at stake, what are the issues, how they might be, is one of the ways that we call for strengthening this sectoral approach to AI regulation. I think having a one-stop shop agency, at least in the UK context, won't actually work with the path that they're going down. The second thing is, Susan said about business practices. I do think there are there's outputs of AI that the effects should be regulated, and there's probably inputs that we need to be thinking about. So you alluded to this when you talked to questions around getting stability in intellectual property issues around AI. Without a kind of regulatory environment that provides stability in large language models and other generative models, we won't see the second order development of new kinds of innovations built on those. So if it is actually in the interest of innovation, it's in the interest of entrepreneurship and the small startups that will be building on top of these models to get the governance of them right. And so one of the most important things we think we can be doing right now in terms of governing, quote unquote, governing AI, is making sure we get those guardrails right in terms of the models that other companies are going to build on. If we can get those issues right, then suddenly we start to see the benefits of how smaller companies will be able to develop on other things. If we continue to have challenges with, say, stabilities, IP issues are going to scare a lot of potential innovators off. So that's that's the kind of more proportionate approach that's being taken here in the UK.
Thank you so much for that, Katie.
So, I can't say that I know whether a single regulator or, the regulators we have, but newly empowered, is the right approach. But I will say that I definitely gravitate towards moving now with the things that we have, partially sort of out of in the US, a very like practical problem we have, which is that governance is very hard at the moment, right? Like governance through Congress specifically. And so, but we are very close in the US. We were very close to having, for instance, comprehensive consumer privacy legislation, which actually would very much impact, I think, how these foundational models are built. And we need better translation of the copyright law we have in terms of how it does and doesn't apply here. That might actually have to happen through courts, or maybe it could happen through legislation. I don't know. But, let's move with the levers that we have. The privacy community has forever been sort of trying to balance, we're making arguments that we need to balance both some restrictions on input for sort of avoidance of surveillance issues, as well as basic human fairness, and but also balance those with legislation that would prevent harms, or that would have redress for harms when they occur. So there's really good work in the privacy space, which absolutely applies here around harms, how we define them, and how we might both mitigate and then address them when they do occur. So there's sort of all of the stuff that's like ready to go, and I feel like that hasn't been enough of a part of the conversation at the legislative level, that yes, the way that these technologies are using data is fundamentally new. The outputs are fundamentally new, but we have all of the stuff that might be useful. Let's start there.
Thank you so much for that. So we're going to go to audience questions. So the next half hour focuses on what they'd like to know. And so our first question from Emmy is that I liked Professor Neff's interpretation that this is a way for the US and China to get together and save face. However, since the US has been so focused on AI with democratic values, is there a viable path towards productive cooperation with China?
That's a great question. My friend Barry O'Sullivan in Ireland says the field of AI ethics is a separate field divided by a common language, right? When we say democratic values in the United States, we mean one thing when it comes to AI. But of course, China is very proud of the fact that it was one of the first jurisdictions to pass a comprehensive AI set of principles, and to actually put them in place in terms of protecting domestic interests. And I say that because we might not say the same word as democratic, but they certainly think of the way they have approached AI principles as first protecting the domestic interests of China rather than an international standing. So is everything going to be solved because the US and China will be in a room together at Bletchley Park? Absolutely not. But can we begin to have some clarity on maybe some of the really catastrophic risks that are at stake with certain kinds of AI? Yes. And do I believe, as a researcher, that making sure we have those conversations where we build those international connections among the research community are important? Absolutely. So I think there's an assumption of bad acting on both sides right now, particularly when it comes to AI policy. I'm not particularly optimistic that we're going to be celebrating the AI Safety Summit for years to come, but I am grateful that, at least in the UK, those of us who are working on responsible AI have the opportunity to have this conversation with a whole new set of people paying attention, that we've got real work to do here. So absolutely, what your question raises for me is the importance of those sets of values and what we want to build and what we want to see going forward. That's the fundamental core of responsible AI. So we don't get safe AI without those questions of responsibility built into them. And to be fair, we can't have responsible AI unless it's something that's considering those catastrophic risks of failure.
Thank you so much, Gina. Katie or Tom, did you want to weigh in on this question?
I think only to say, right, I think that Gina's right to emphasize this sort of catastrophic risks. I mean, I think everyone in the world can agree we don't want AI in charge of nuclear weapons that might make mistakes, right? Like that, or there would have to be so many guardrails, right? That's something that everybody, or in charge of weapons in general, right? Like automating weapons with the AI we have now, is dangerous for everyone on Earth. And so I think that's something that can bring everybody to let's think about where those tables are or what those issues are that bring everyone in. And Gina, I think, has really nicely pointed out that is, that's what's under discussion here. The more of those we can find, the better.
Thank you, Katie.
I guess I'll take a little bit of a contrary opinion here. I don't think it's so good to get these organizations together and talking. I think that it's a mistake to interpret China's regulatory efforts on AI as being in good faith when they're not. I mean, China is probably the single biggest systematic abuser of AI technologies. I mean, they use AI not only to infringe on people's civil rights, but to infringe in some ways on people's human rights. You have AI systems that like I said, in urban areas, you can't even cross the street without being identified by an AI system. They have surveillance systems that they use to identify Uyghur people for the purposes of their social suppression. This is a government that has been at a systematic level an AI abuser and likely will continue to be for the foreseeable future. And so giving China a platform, an international platform, to get up there and say, look how we're leading the effort on responsible AI, giving them a platform to divert the discussion onto things like existential risks, where they seem to be taking action, giving them an opportunity to represent themselves as if they have democratic values with respect to governing AI. I think giving them that platform to make bad faith arguments is a bad thing to do. I don't think that is I don't think including them in the conversation in the way that the UK summit will is productive.
Well, with that argument, every concert goer to the Beyonce concert in Cardiff was also photographed and tested against a database of wanted criminals. So, the UK also, I'm going to leave China's human rights, terrible human rights abuses out of the conversation for a moment, simply to say how they talk about what they do with AI it has parallels to how AI is talked about in the West. The sets of values, I completely agree with you, are different and distinct. The same could be said for countries in the West, who also have a kind of surveillance capitalism. And, in terms of the approach, would also be seen as repugnant in China. So, the goals of the AI summit are not to get to some kind of international agreement on what a fundamental regulation of AI could be. Everybody understands that would be impossible. The goals of the AI summit are not to get to an agreement on human rights in business. Everybody agrees that would be impossible. The goals are to begin to map and understand what some of the emerging risks might be from the most advanced systems. And that's a scoping that it may be the only thing that a summit that includes both the US and China could accomplish.
Did you want to add anything?
I don't know. I think it's difficult for me to compare the use of, you know, say face recognition technology for as part of a social control campaign at a large scale by a government organization. It's not quite the same as having a private company that, you know, checks whether there are, I don't know, repeat offenders coming into a Beyonce concert. That being said, I do agree with you that the issue of surveillance in Western
that was the Welsh
concerning.
police. That wasn't a private company. That was the Welsh police.
Okay, sure, that's fair. That's fair. No, yeah, and you know, to acknowledge, we all, even in the U.S., we also have police agencies that will use face recognition as a tool, right?
Or,
so
you know,
I'm not trying to say that
corporate data
that policies in Western countries are always I guess in compliance with the values that I would like to have. But the difference is the way that we have these conversations. In a Western country, I think we have good faith conversations with politicians about what we want legal frameworks to look like. I don't think that the representations that we hear from the Chinese government are in good faith. I don't think that they have intentions of changing their behavior with respect to AI. You know, in any near-term future. Whereas in Western countries, I do think we have good faith discussions about that, and we could end up with regulations that prohibit the government from doing certain things or prohibit companies from doing certain things. So it's not, you know, it's not that the behaviors, the use cases of AI are completely different. It's just that I don't like giving China a platform to represent that sort of I guess dignifies and represents China as having good faith representations with respect to this issue, when I don't think that they do. That's the difference. But yeah, I'm not trying to argue that there are no you know, morally concerning uses of AI happening in the West. That's definitely not the case.
Maybe we should just be clear, very brief summary of what China's generative AI regulations are. They're divided into consumer facing and then commercial use facing. And basically they say that for generative AI, firms should not misuse personal data or copyrighted data. And the government is exempt from those rules. So I think you both have very important points to make. The United States just started an AI dialogue with China. So we're starting to move in the direction that Gina has said is necessary, but to see if there are shared values, since, as you know, Tom, so much AI research is done in China or between Chinese and US researchers. We benefit from that cooperation. We learn from each other. Is more dialogue better? I don't know. Katie, did you want to say something here?
I mean, no, I think Tom and Gina have done a really nice job illustrating sort of both perspectives here, both of which I respect. And
I think the stakes are incredibly high, and you know, just as Tom laid out, the stakes about what we might care about, I think everybody on this call cares about, aren't the same as those from the risks to you know, the human rights abuses, the surveillance capitalism. None of that is on the table for this summit. The everyday uses of AI, the questions around bias, the questions around fraud, these are not the threats to democracy, the stability of states, the trust in each other. That's just not what's on the table, right? The military uses of frontier tech and how today's technologies might be used for extreme catastrophic purposes are the only things there. And I think that's in part for the reasons that Tom outlines, right? There's not enough agreement.
Is it is the focus going to be sort of known challenges around, for instance, military uses, or is there going to be a real thread of artificial general intelligence and this sort of idea of, you know, existential risk, not from our weapons, not from our existing weapons, but from the thing itself? Do you know to what degree that is sort of being taken seriously at the summit?
The summit the agenda has been posted. And there are these roundtables, multidisciplinary roundtables planned. for looking and mapping out what these threats could be. So it really is seen as a first step to convening international conversations. I think, just to follow up on Tom's question, there really is a geopolitical dividing of the world going on around East versus West technologies. And that chasm has only gotten greater. So the idea that you would convene a summit, that from the British point of view, the idea that there could be a summit convened and leave out the world's second biggest research and innovation hub seemed wrong, right? And particularly when that country made an announcement on Friday that they're going to give, their responsible AI, they're going to give their technology research and development to the countries aligned through the Belt and Road Initiative. So, you really do have a remapping of infrastructural investment. This is a page in the Chinese playbook. And the UK government has said, let's engage that rather than not.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything? Okay, here's another diss of this discussion. So Meg says, I would be interested to hear the panelists' reflection on what meaningful public participation in AI governance would look like in an ideal world. Does anyone want to comment on that? Gina, you want to say something?
Oh, I want to hear Katie on this. I absolutely have things to say, but I want to bring Katie into this.
Okay, this is fun because I get to do my ideal world, right? I just asked for an ideal world, which is what I think about all the time. I don't know how achievable this is, but in my ideal world, AI, the way it governs us, the way it is shaped, occurs all the way from decisions made at the very beginning of development, all the way through understanding and evaluating the systems afterwards, all the way through sort of having top, government level governance. So I think of this as little p policies all the way up to big P policies. And I think there's room for public participation at every one of those steps along the way. So right now, the way that these these largest models are developed is one of sort of data vacuuming, right? What data can we find, right? And then what can we train the models to do with that data, combined with, and I think we forget this a lot, humans with tuning through asking lots of contract workers to respond to what the results that the model is putting out, right? So there are already humans in the loop. The problem is that right now, none of that is decided in a democratic way. And so that's crowd work. It's not participation. And I know that that's a weird, there's, what is the difference? The difference is power, right? The paying contractors tiny amounts of money to go through graphic and hateful material to tune it out of the systems is not the same as having people in a discussion about what the system should do with what data it would be appropriate to train it. Does that data mean what we think it does, right? And so the problem is we don't know how to do that, right? This is not this is participatory design of a user interface is a hard challenge. A participatory design of a large language model is, we just don't know what that looks like, right? But we've got researchers let's figure it out, right? And I understand this is something that I get excited for academics to work on because it's outside of market pressures. This is going to be expensive. This is going to be hard. This is what researchers are for, right? Is to figure out what does this look like? What does it look like for communities to have direct input into hiring algorithms, right? And what does it look like to select the data, but also tune the models in ways that people can sort of understand as fair or as consensus or as something that they've had a voice into or a democratic process in some way. And then, we can move right through evaluation. So when we start to evaluate these models, whose metrics are we using? Who gets to have a voice in that conversation? That's an important question. And then, of course, democratic governance of these, which, luckily we've got processes. That's the part we have processes in place for. Whether or not they're working as well as they might be in any given moment is one question, but we know how to do that part, right? It's the rest of this chain that we need to figure out how to do. And I'm excited and there are researchers working everywhere. Data and Society is working on this. Trails Institute at the University of Maryland, which I will hype here, which is a new institute. MGW University and Morgan State University is working on methods and models for this. folks all over. That we've actually been doing a literature review on participatory AI development, and it's happening all over Latin America. It's happening all over Africa. This is something that we are going to figure out. And there's going to be great ways to do it. Check back with me in 5 years.
Well, and if I can add on to that, in our prep call, Katie really wanted to, remind us that when we're talking about AI, we're talking about kinds of power, and the kinds of power that will literally power decision making, will literally power governments, will literally power corporations. And I think that's partly the conversation that we've had here today. And it's something that, groups like Trails and the new initiative that you have, that multi-university initiative that you have around responsible AI, and then Responsible AI UK, which is this consortium of the £33 million consortium to really invest in that research. This is what we can do with research, and this is what we can do when we connect researcher to researcher, right? We can really drill down into the kinds of practices it will take to imagine new kinds of futures. And that's what gets us really excited. And it's the capacity that we have when we work in research rather than when we're trying to, push and develop product. We have a different kind of privilege that we get to work on these things.
Did you want to add anything to this?
I actually didn't hear the last few words of the question when you read it, so I'm not exactly sure what I should be responding to best address that.
Political participation. Like how do you get people who are struggling to deal with, their jobs, their family? How do you get them to care about AI and to participate meaningfully in the governance of AI?
Yeah, I think, well, yeah, one issue that concerns me a bit is I don't know, one of the things about this UK summit, I don't really understand exactly what the agenda for it is, but it seems like it's focusing very much on maybe futurist concerns about AI risks. I think that the media has a tendency to focus on the most hyperbolic futurist concerns because those are the things that get the most clicks. But I don't think that people necessarily think about the nitty-gritty issues, the boring issues, issues like copyright and data usage, issues like possibilities of social media bots, things that are really risks right now. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't think that the conversations that we have, at least in the media, are very productive. But and I'm not sure what the solution to that is. I'm not sure what the solution to that is, but I don't think that when you read the discussion that happens, at least in the media, I don't think that people, I don't think it promotes a lot of thinking about like the current, immediate issues that we have with AI. And that's one of the reasons we don't have very, very productive political discussions. In some cases, I will say we do have when things rise to the level of prominence in the media, sometimes we do have prominent political discussions. Like one of these issues is, with respect to face recognition, going back to that issue, there are local jurisdictions in the United States where people's constituents were alarmed by the use of face recognition, and now it's been banned and police organizations can't use it. Right? So there are situations where we do have forward movement and regulations do happen, but usually that requires it requires the media to take more of a responsible role in educating people. And right now, when I look at what's going on in the media, I don't really see that.
I think there's a really big role for watchdog groups here. And I think I agree that the media attention to this issue is uneven. There are places where there's good media attention, like really, detailed. There are some journalists who are really working on these issues, but there's a lot of other voices. But watchdog groups, I think, are a big part of this. I will also say there's a history in science studies of public participation in science, right? And figuring out how to increase public participation in scientific regulation issues, things like nanotechnology, and particularly in Europe, actually, European academics have really been on this. It's a little bit, and it went kind of out of fashion for a bit, getting sort of civic interest groups together, diverse groups of people, and you do some, you do some readings where you play a game or you do something that sort of engages folks, and then you can have a dialogue about values, about, what you want systems to support. There are sort of ways of doing this that, they weren't cool for a while, but I think they're coming back. They're big, they're expensive, they take a lot of people's time, but they are sort of constructive ways to have conversations about tough technical issues. Right. If we can have discussions about the risks of nanotech, I think we can do it with AI. It's understandable stuff. But yes, we have to really experiment with methods and experiment with engagement methods that are workable.
And these conversations about what people want are happening in communities, right? They're already happening in communities around. So a series of protests happened in the UK around, F the algorithm because of what happened to kids' school scores during COVID. And, it was a widespread and public understanding that these choices get made around how people get ranked, and those choices can matter for lives. And those are really vibrant conversations. They're not necessarily conversations about the frontier of AI, but they're conversations about what matters to people, and they're understanding that these are infrastructural questions. These are questions about power that's getting built into their choice architecture right now. And I am optimistic about how people are getting involved in these questions.
Appreciate that. Can you all stay for one more question? It might bring us over a little bit. Yes?
Yep.
Okay. So Oliver asked, for what AI risk do we want to see a single global approach, and for which types of risks is it okay to have different approaches in different jurisdictions? It's hard to generalize. That question is huge. Does anyone want to give it a try? Katie, should we start with you? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, Gina, go ahead, and then.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think we can have one global approach. If I think about ranking the risks that humanity faces right now, I would probably put climate change, that we are clearly in the middle of. We are, the changes of climate disaster are happening. And we don't have a global approach for that. I'd rather see our global political capital trying to solve what will be absolutely devastating for many lives around the planet. That said, there will be multiple jurisdictional approaches, and probably rather than having a global regulatory approach or governance approach, probably going to have global coordination and education. So many people have called for an IPCC for AI, some kind of international body that helps manage, coordinate research, helps to alert, helps to connect, helps to identify risks. I think that's a kind of global approach that can happen. I don't think we're going to see any one single global regulation around AI.
Katie, you were gonna speak?
Yeah, I mean, one of the fundamental tensions of trying to think about regulating AI is that values belong to contexts, and finding universal values. I mean, this has been a tension through this whole conversation, right? Universal values that the entire globe could agree on, that can also meaningfully underpin these technologies, which are, drawing from complex contexts, is really hard. This is hard even the sort of hope that we see is all at the community level, right? It's like communities saying, no, not for us, right? And so how do we move from contexts, where we have sort of established norms and forms of governance, to sort of a set of technologies, which of course are global. And we've had this challenge before, right? With internet networking and all kinds of things. We have lots of global technologies, and we've sort of had to piece it together, and it doesn't and different countries still do different things, right? And like cut off, international technologies. And so this is an ongoing problem, it's ongoing tension. I don't think it gets solved at the global level first ever, right? I think that's right. Like we have to start on a smaller scale.
Yeah, I agree. We're not going to have like a unified global regulation framework, but in some ways, in areas adjacent to AI, we've had regulations that are, I would say, maybe semi-global. If you look at something like GDPR, it's a European regulation that governs the internet, but it also, certain provisions of GDPR are widely respected now by organizations outside of Europe, just because they have to operate globally, and it makes the most sense to just try to be in regulatory compliance broadly, right? So I don't think that we will be able to say that we have like a concrete umbrella framework that everyone agrees formally to follow. But this patchwork of laws that we're building, I do think that they will sort of coalesce to some degree, especially when you look at things that pertain to operating the internet, things that pertain to where your data can come from, where can you scrape data from, these kinds of issues. These more local regulations tend to become global. And so I'm hopeful that maybe we'll have something like, yes, I'm hoping we can have something that's sort of semi-global, that over time different actors will have conversations with their neighbors, and we'll sort of walk our way towards some sort of soft consensus, at least within the Western world. But we'll see.
Thank you for that. Any final comments on the AI Safety Summit and what it can achieve? Gina?
I think just as our conversation today has shown us, this is a tall task. I think there's a tall task ahead, and I'm grateful we've had a chance to talk about this.
Yeah, Susan, thanks
Katie?
for bringing us together.
Tom?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
I'm really curious
audience, thank you so. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying, I don't have a really super concrete sense of exactly what the topics are going to be, but I'm hopeful. I'm really eager to see what's going to be discussed. I'm really interested to see what comes out of this. I hope that it's positive.
It's only going to be about frontier AI models, whatever that means.
Yes.
And that
we'll find out what
definition
that
seems,
means.
yes, and that definition, CSAT, Stanford, the UK government, all have different definitions. So I got to say, I'm a little lost here, but okay. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll have another webinar next month. So we welcome your ideas and concerns, so please get in touch with us at the Hub. And thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers, Katie Shilton, Tom Goldstein, Gina Neff. Thank you so much, guys.
Susan.
Thanks, everybody.
Have